Astronomy in Reverse by Pansley. Chapter 21. Moving Forward. Bucky? Peter is requesting that I unlock the door. Friday's voice pulls him from a fitful and restless sleep, what feels like an eternity later. It takes him a moment to get his bearings. His body aches with a familiar ancient stiffness, and he realizes gradually that he fell asleep on the floor, sitting beside his bed with his head tipped back against the mattress. He grunts when Friday repeats herself and forces out a sleep-heavy "Fine" that grates on his own ears. He only manages to pull himself up enough to actually sit on the bed when his door is pushed open. Light streams into his dark room and makes him suddenly aware of how late it must be. "Dad?" Bucky blinks at Peter's silhouette standing in the doorway. If it was anyone else, he probably wouldn't notice the slight lean in the boy's posture, how he's subtly pressing his shoulder against the door jamb, letting it take his weight, his arm crossing his chest to keep anything from touching it. The color in his face is better, but the pain he's in is still so obvious. I was wondering, do you want to watch a movie or play something maybe?" Bucky's stomach twists like someone's trying to wring it out. The taste of bile rises in the back of his throat. "You should be in bed," he says, trying not to notice the way Peter's expression falls. "Oh!" Peter shifts his weight from one foot to the other, grimaces, and shifts it back. "Well, there's a TV in my room. We could watch Netflix, or bring in a board game or something, or one of Mr. Stark's gaming consoles."
"You need to rest,"
Bucky insists. Then, when the hurt look on Peter's face makes his throat close up, adds,
"Sorry, kiddo, it's just not tonight."
"Okay." Peter gives him a weak, slightly forced smile and steps back into the hallway. "Good night, Dad." Bucky doesn't say it back, just drops his face into his hands after Peter has pulled the door shut and begun to walk away. Now that he's aware of it, it's all he can see. How could he not have known his own son? There's no excuse, not when he and Peter spent the last year living in one room together, sleeping 5 feet apart, sharing every meal. Peter is the most open and honest person Bucky's ever met. He's told Bucky everything, big and little things alike. And still he didn't know the boy was starving himself just to stay with him. He presses his forehead into the hard shell of his kneecap, his eyes falling shut. A horrible, intrusive thought floods into his mind, as forceful and booming as a battering ram. He was never the father he wanted to be. He was just the first person Peter met after his aunt and uncle died who didn't neglect or abuse him. That was apparently all it took, a home worth starving for. Any hint of pride or triumph he gained from that identity has been washed away in the stream of guilt cutting through him. And Tony had known instantly. One look at Peter and he knew about the abandonment issues, about the starving, the depression, the anxiety, all of it. 5 minutes together and Tony Stark had every shred of knowledge he needed to be a better father than Bucky could ever hope to be, and the part that kills him is Peter would have been better off. A flash of Peter lying in his arms in that field flares in the back of his mind and startles him. He can still feel the warmth spreading over his stomach as Peter bled out, as his blood soaked through his clothes and stained his skin, as real as if it were happening now. He'll never forget that sensation as long as he lives. Half a step away from falling back into the Winter Soldier's mindset and still vividly, acutely aware of his child dying in his arms. Tears well up in his eyes. It never would have happened if Steve and Tony had been there. It never would have happened if he'd done the right thing and turned Peter away or taken him to someone else. Frank and Sharon would have taken him if Bucky had asked, but he never did. It was selfishness, all of it. Selfishness and stupidity. He knew he was good for nothing. He just liked the way Peter made him feel like less of a monster. How it was harder to remember the horrible things he'd done when that kid was smiling at him like that. Peter made him feel human, and Bucky didn't want to lose that. He wanted to be Peter's dad. It was the best name anyone had ever given him. But he didn't deserve it, and he knew that. That's the worst part, really, having all his doubts collected over the last year poured over him like boiling water. He knew he didn't deserve to be called Peter's dad, and now there's nowhere to hide from that fact. He swallows the lump in his throat and wills the dampness in his eyes to go with it. A sharp, aching stab of pain spreads through his chest, remembering the first night he came here. If only he could go back in time and agree to Tony's offer, let him take Peter away. Peter would have been heartbroken, but he never would have been shot. Isn't that what parenthood is supposed to be about? Putting your kids' needs before your own? He doesn't know how he could ever have the gall to call himself Peter's dad when he hasn't done a single thing right by him in all the time he's known him. The sob finally works its way out of his throat, and Bucky lowers his head, defeated. He knows the truth now with startling and abundant clarity. Since the very first day they met, Peter has never needed him nearly as much as he's needed Peter. He tramples down on his grief as he listens to the boy's retreating footsteps limping down the hall. 3, then 4, then Tony's voice drifts in from outside his room.
Hey, Pete, thought I heard you get up. You hungry?
Even through the door, Peter's voice is quieter than it should be. Oh, no thanks, Mr. Stark, I'm okay.
You sure?
There's an edge to Tony's voice that Bucky can just barely hear, that forced casual tone, an attempt to mask how serious he is.
You haven't eaten anything in quite a while. Your healing factor needs food and rest to work the way it's supposed to, you know.
Yeah, I'm not really hungry though. Something wells up in Bucky that feels foreign to him then. His body goes taut and he pushes himself to his feet and wrenches the door open, stepping into the hallway and startling both its occupants. Peter looks relieved at first, until he sees the look on Bucky's face.
The look of anger. Peter,
he snaps, cold and sharp.
You need to eat. Get your ass in that kitchen and get some food into you.
Peter quails at the tone of his voice, completely caught off guard. Bucky's never spoken to him like that, not once. But the anger feels like a cooling balm, chases the guilt and self-loathing away for a painful brief moment. So when Peter opens his mouth and says, "But I'm not," Bucky slams his fist into the wall almost hard enough to dent it and seethes.
Peter Benjamin Parker. I'm not going to say it again. Kitchen. Now!
The kid takes a step back, then another, then turns and skirts around Tony without looking at him. He heads down the hall and Bucky watches him go, acutely aware of the way Tony's gaze is boring into him, disbelieving and scornful.
What the hell are you? It has nothing to do with you,
Bucky says, turning to slam his bedroom door shut before Tony can even respond. He doesn't sleep anymore that night. A few hours later, Peter's soft footsteps come limping back up the hall, pausing outside his door. Bucky sits in the eerie stillness of night and waits, just listening to Peter linger there. But a minute passes, and Peter doesn't knock, just carries himself away from Bucky's door and through his own. Bucky hates that he feels relieved. When the sun starts to rise, he emerges from his room and makes himself a cup of coffee. The house is silent, but he's starting to get used to that. He waits to see if Steve will wake up for some of that early morning exercise he's so fond of and join him, but by the time he's done his cup, there's still no sign of anyone else. He clears his throat, startled by how loud it is in the empty room.
Friday, how much did Peter eat yesterday?
Peter consumed an estimated 1,700 calories yesterday, Bucky. Even he knows that's way too low.
How much does he need with his metabolism?
According to Mr. Stark's research, Peter requires a daily minimum of 4,000 calories to maintain his health and approximately 6,000 a day to encourage growth, given his current age and below average height and weight. 6,000 calories? Peter probably didn't eat that much in 3 days back in Queens, let alone daily. Only eating 28% of what your body actually needs probably feels damn close to starvation. Bucky's felt that kind of hunger before. When he thinks of it, the phantom ache flares up in his stomach, a pain so profound it's impossible to forget, ingrained in the very fibers of his muscles. He wouldn't wish it on anyone, not Zemo, not even Rumlow. And yet he spent the last year inflicting it on the person he loves most in all the world. Why couldn't I see it? But Tony had. It was probably the first thought that popped into his head when he laid eyes on Peter. Took one look at him and saw he was underfed before he saw anything else, the way a real parent would. He may have done his research beforehand, but that didn't mean he knew Peter, not like Bucky knew him. Or at least not the way he believed he had.
Friday,
he said, staring down at the coffee stain at the bottom of his cup.
Could you do me a favor?
I am programmed to help Mr. Stark's guests with whatever they need, Bucky. Friday answers instantly, her tone endlessly patient, a servant who never sleeps. He would feel guilty, but there's none left to go around.
Would you be able to set reminders for Peter to make sure he eats? I
don't want to yell at him again.
I think I need some space for a little while. If you could remind him to eat and how much, and try to get him as close to that 6,000 mark as we can, that would help.
Of course, Bucky. He has no idea how a robot can sound motherly, but Tony somehow found a way. I will do my best to encourage Peter to ingest a sufficient amount of nutrition daily. Would you like me to inform you if my reminders prove to be unsuccessful? Bucky's stomach twists. He thinks back to that moment in the hallway when he lost it, how Peter had looked at him. He never wants to see that look on the kid's face again, but if Friday tells him to eat and he doesn't...
Yeah.
He sighs, hanging his head in his hands.
I'll take it from there.
He locks himself in his room for the rest of the day, instructing Friday to deflect Peter and Steve as much as possible. He's less worried about Tony. The man hasn't so much as attempted to speak to him since last night, though Bucky doesn't mind. One less person to keep at bay, to shut out until he's got a grip, until the roar of blood in his ears quiets down enough to let him think, until he can bear to lay eyes on Peter again. Whatever Friday tells Peter, thankfully, the boy does his best to listen. Bucky expected him to linger outside his door like a neglected dog, but the kid only knocks twice, first thing in the morning and again in the early afternoon, and blissfully leaves once Friday shoos him away. Steve is less obedient. He's never been someone who accepts a cold shoulder, not when he feels he's owed something, or more importantly, thinks it's something he can fix. It's a miracle that Bucky can remember how he's always been like that. Didn't matter how big the world's problems were. 100 years ago, little 5'0" Steve Grant Rogers was out there trying to solve them. He applies the same tenacity to reaching Bucky now, trying to get through to him, trying to get him to let him in. Bucky would be begrudgingly glad of it if he didn't feel like his skin was about to split down all his seams, something dark and ugly emerging from underneath, spawned of anger and fear. He feels stuck in the Earth's gravitational pull. He can either go up, rising from the broken shell of his current self, a vessel of his own rage and hate and helplessness, or he can sink. Let the guilt and fear drag him down, collapsing in on himself like an old home weathered by too many storms. He's terrified of what he'll say the next time he sees Peter, terrified that his anger will spill out of him again, scalding to the touch, when the only person he's truly angry at is himself. There's an ugly, hateful thing deep inside of him that wants to grab Peter by the shoulders, shake some sense in him, screaming, "Why didn't you tell me?" The urge to scream it is lodged in his throat even now, ready to burst the moment he opens his mouth. "How did I not see it? You told me that, Peter. Why'd you have to go and hide something so important from me, of all people? How could you?" And if he's being honest, more than the anger, there's the fear of what sort of hell his mind will conjure up when he sees Peter's face. The image of his small trembling body soaked in blood is already projecting on the forefront of his mind, looping on repeat like a cheap flick at a dollar movie. The way he'd gone lax in his arms when his heart stopped beating. How heavy and light he was at the same time, so small but dead weight in Bucky's lap. That was almost the last time Peter ever closed his eyes, and if it had been, it would have been Bucky's fault. But just after the sun sets, Friday chirps to life above him and says, "Bucky, I am worried Peter will not reach his caloric intake goal for today at his current rate." All his muscles are stiff from sitting curled up and not moving, his arms and legs unfurl from his body slowly like an old hose being unwound for the first time in years.
How many times has he eaten?
"Twice. I am attempting to coax him into having dinner, but he's insistent that he's not hungry." She pauses. Bucky can't help but wonder what thinking feels like when you're an AI. Is she at a loss for words or just trying to be tactful? "I believe he would be amenable to having more to eat if you did as well." Tactful then. Bucky grunts, but doesn't tell her to mind her own business. He's the one who asked for her help, after all. It's not her fault that she's right.
Time to face new music, huh, Friday?
"If I may say, Bucky, you have overcome tougher challenges than this. It's going to be all right." How strange that Tony programmed her like this. It's almost sad to think of him down in his lab, hands poring over hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lines of code to get her just right, to make her kind and wise and comforting. Sadder yet to wonder if Tony was the one who really needed her, someone to tell him that it was going to be okay. None of this is Tony's fault. Some of the tension in Bucky's chest lessens, and he takes a deep breath, just focusing on where his body is, what he can feel and smell and hear all around him. He should apologize. He has a lot of apologizing to do, to all of them. But first, he needs to make sure Peter eats. Schooling his features, Bucky unlocks the door and silently heads for the living room. Peter is curled up on the couch, zoning out to some TV show, with Steve sitting beside him, quietly drawing on a sketch pad. They both notice him at the same time, and Peter perks up like a freshly watered daisy, sitting up so fast he irritates his gunshot wound if the wince of pain he makes is any indication. "Dad!" "Hey," Bucky says. Steve smiles at him like he hasn't spent the last 10 hours trying to burrow through his bedroom door, and closes his sketch pad. Peter heaves himself off the couch and toddles close, his face bright with relief. Bucky's stomach clenches and he turns to head for the kitchen.
"Come on, Pete. It's dinner time."
The boy is right behind him as he leaves the room, Steve's heavy footsteps not far behind. "Are you feeling better?" Peter asks, sounding so normal that for a moment it's easy for Bucky to forget that he'd been shot only 2 days ago. "I made Friday promise to unlock the door if something was seriously wrong, but she didn't, so I don't know if—"
"Sorry, kiddo."
Bucky keeps his back to him as he rummages around in the fridge, looking for something easy to make, something that can be done quickly. In the end, he decides on sandwiches and fruit, standing up and grabbing an entire loaf of bread.
"I'm still not 100%.
The way he says it, he knows Peter understands what he really means, but he's actually apologizing for.
But you need to eat."
"Oh!" Peter doesn't try to hide his disappointment. He shuffles a little closer, standing at Bucky's side the way he always used to back in Queens, eager to learn whatever Bucky had to teach. "You know, I'm feeling a lot better. I'm practically healed up already. It barely even hurts. I really only notice it when I, jump off of carriages too fast." A hopeful smile graces the boy's face, but Bucky can't bring himself to return it.
"We even did some light exercise earlier. You should have seen him."
Steve cuts in from behind them, throwing his hands up defensively when Bucky shoots him a cold look over his shoulder.
"Come on, I said light exercise. It was practically physiotherapy. Just to keep the bed sores at bay, I promise."
"Yeah, I didn't even get winded," Peter says, grabbing a few plates to start piling the sandwiches on. "At this rate, I won't even have a scar by tomorrow."
"That might be a bit of wishful thinking,"
Steve teases when Bucky doesn't say a word. You can see the expectant look on Peter's face in his peripheral vision, how he's waiting for something. Something Bucky doesn't have it in him to give right now, unable to so much as look him in the eyes. The boy's face falls when Bucky silently adds another sandwich to his plate, his shoulders slumping as he picks it up to carry it over to the table.
"Peter, wait a moment."
Peter turns back, eager, hopeful, then wilting when Bucky simply adds another sandwich to his plate. Bucky looks him in the eyes and says, pointedly,
"I want you to eat it all. You hear me?"
Then reaches into the fruit bowl on the counter, grabs a peach and adds it to the stack of fruit he's already haphazardly piled.
"Every bite."
He expects an argument, braces himself for it. Peter stares down at his plate like Bucky just handed him a dead rabbit and told him to eat it raw, fur and all. The plate is so full and heavy in his hands he needs both of them to keep it balanced, keep the fruit from rolling off onto the floor. But after a moment, Peter looks back up at him and simply nods, gives a resigned understanding. "Okay." And Bucky loves him so fiercely in that moment he wants to weep. Neither of them want to fight, and dearest son is 15 years old and keeping the floodgates closed, diverting the water when he's supposed to be the child, the unreasonable teenager. You wouldn't be able to blame Peter if the boy put his foot down and demanded to know what the heck is going on, what this is all about. But Peter can see it would do him no good, and maybe he just doesn't want to start a fight, not after the last few days. It's a moment like this, when Bucky is humbled by Peter's maturity and compassion, that make him want to latch onto his identity as Peter's dad and never, ever let it go. It's such a source of pride. until he remembers how warm the blood soaking into his lap was, how thick the scent, and the moment is gone. Bucky has nothing to do with the wise, kind-hearted person Peter is turning out to be. The only thing he'd done in the last year was put food on the table, and he hadn't even done that right. He wants to pull Peter into his arms, apologize for everything. Instead, he nods toward the dining table, says,
"Go eat,"
and turns to head back to his room. Peter starts to follow and then stops. The footsteps that replace his, too heavy to be anyone else's but Steve's. "Buck," Steve says when they reach his bedroom door. "Hey, can we talk for a second?" Here it comes. He's surprised Steve managed to hold it in this long, to be honest. Holding his tongue was never his strong suit, and gaining a foot of height and 200 pounds of muscle didn't change that.
"Yeah."
"Look, Steve takes a deep breath, his hand warm around Bucky's wrist. "We've all had a bad couple of days, and I know there's nothing I can say to really make it better." Bucky waits, wondering when the lecture will begin, expecting this isn't like you, it's time to get your shit together. Instead, Steve surprises him and says, "So I just want you to know we're in this together, Buck, you and me. And I mean for all of it. Hydra, Zemo, what's going on with Peter, all of it. If you need space right now, that's fine, I can wait. But I don't want you to go in that room thinking you have to fix everything by yourself. You have me." He embraces Bucky from behind, and Bucky lets him, warmed by the touch of Steve's forehead on the back of his neck. "I'm with you till the end of the line," he said. He whispers into his nape, squeezes him so hard it forcefully evens out his shaky breaths. "We're going to get through this together. Just tell me what you need." And Bucky doesn't know what to say. He was expecting the kind of stubborn, don't argue with me attitude Steve used to torture him with when they were young. How he never listened to anyone, not even Bucky. How he'd unintentionally pick fights because nothing could change his mind once it was made up. All the trouble he used to get himself into back then. How much worse it would have been if Bucky had been there to pull him out more often than not. That was the Steve he was expecting to see, catching him in this hallway before Bucky could return to his isolation. But instead, Steve holds him close like they've been lovers their whole lives and tells him it'll be okay. He can give Bucky space if that's what he needs. Bucky wants to say he doesn't know what he needs. How could he? But he's too grateful for what Steve is offering, so he sags in the other man's arms and says,
"I need to be alone,"
comforted when Steve squeezes him tight.
"Can you make sure Peter eats, please? Friday can only be so convincing."
Steve kisses the back of his neck and lets him go. "Yeah, of course, I'll take care of it." Bucky wants to say he loves him because he really, really does. How incredible it is to find someone who will step in and take care of shit when you don't know which way is up. The indescribable sweetness of that. "I'll watch him, Buck. He'll be okay. Can I do anything else to help?" Bucky turns in his arms, presses their foreheads together, and holds them like that, still and sharing each breath. For a moment the storm quiets, the pounding headache in the base of his skull dims to a gentle thud. Steve is here. He can carry it for a little while until Bucky's regained some of his strength. Bucky can trust him even with his son.
"Like you,"
he says as he pulls away, answering Steve's question without saying so. Steve lets him go, stands there as Bucky disappears through his doorway and calls, "I'm here if you need me," before the door clicks shut. Bucky doesn't leave his room for another 2 days. Steve brings food but doesn't bother to knock, just leaves the plates on the hallway floor outside his door like offerings at an altar. It's hard to eat, harder to speak. He doesn't know where to go. All of his energy is used up just trying to hold himself together, his body threatening to break apart, separating at every joint to scatter like leaves in the wind. It's hard to think about any moment beyond the one he's currently in. Every time he tries, all he can hear is that last weak gasp of breath Peter made as his eyes fell shut. Like every attempt to move forward must be immediately punished by yanking him back, thrusting him down into that field, some scornful cosmic voice saying, "See what you did? You got what you deserved." Peter may not have died in that field, but something did. The grief is immeasurable, and it suffocates him from the inside, swelling until it fills his entire body. He aches from the loss. Peter survived, But Bucky still lost his son, grieving his own fatherhood. He was a fool to ever believe something so precious could be his. He can hear them when he presses his body against the wall and really listens. Peter and Steve talking. Tony voice-edged like he hasn't slept well in days, grouchy but still making Peter laugh. The clang of dishes as they cook. The rumble of rock music as Tony finds something to work on, dragging Peter along. Steve's footsteps leading up to his door, lingering and leaving. Peter's soft voice asking Friday to let him in, Friday gently turning him away. It all blends together as the days pass. He wants to fling the door open and join them, but that insidious voice in his head sneers, "Haven't you done enough?" On the third day, Friday coaxes him out of a restless sleep and says, "Bucky, King T'Challa has returned and he would like to speak with you." King T'Challa. Bucky had assumed the man would be too busy running his newly appointed kingdom to visit them again for a long time, if ever. Part of him is relieved. He never got to properly thank him for everything he's done for him. And part of him feels sick to his stomach. He can't fathom why T'Challa would want to speak to him beyond to check in, to pat him on the shoulder and ask if he's okay in that sympathetic tone that makes Bucky's bones itch. Not that T'Challa's been overly warm toward him since they met, but still, it's the only reason he can think of, and picturing it makes him acutely uncomfortable.
"I guess I can't refuse, huh?"
"You dare not!" Bucky smiles at Friday's tone, light and teasing. He throws on some clean clothes and a half-assed attempt to show some respect and follows Friday's directions out of the room, surprised when she leads to the back door and out onto the deck, where he spots T'Challa waiting at the end of the long dock above the water. T'Challa turns as he approaches and smiles, though his dark eyes are as focused and calculating as always. "Bucky, good to see you."
"You too,"
Bucky says, taking his hand.
"It must be bittersweet to be told congratulations on your coronation, given the circumstances, but for what it's worth, you're going to make a good king."
"Thank you." T'Challa surprises him by sitting down on the edge of the dock in his expensive suit, his legs dangling off the ledge over the water. He gestures for Bucky to join him, and he does, too humbled by the whole thing to refuse. "I wanted to check in, to see how you were doing."
"Yeah, I figured as much."
"Captain Rogers told me it has been a rough few days," T'Challa says, hands folded in his lap, staring out at the lake. As wise as a sage and 60 years younger than Bucky at least. "Thankfully, Peter seems to have fully recovered." Yeah, no harm done, right? Everything is hunky-dory and back to normal. Bucky barely manages to stop himself from scoffing.
"He's moving around a lot more,"
he says, instead agreeing.
"He's not the easiest person to place on bed rest. Too much hyperactivity crammed in that little head of his."
T'Challa chuckles. They sit in companionable silence for a moment before the man clears his throat and says, "I didn't come just to check on you." Bucky meets his gaze but can't place the emotion he finds there. "There are some things I'd like to discuss." Something about the way he says it sets Bucky's nerves on edge, but he simply nods his head, asking him to continue. T'Challa takes a moment, and the silence makes Bucky feel sick to his stomach. Eventually, T'Challa says, "I know what Baron Zemo was after," as he gazes out at the water. "You were not the true intended victim of his crimes, merely a pawn." He waits for the man to elaborate, but when he doesn't, Bucky shoots him a look and says,
"So it was."
"It is not my place to say." T'Challa's face is hard suddenly, like he's come to a treacherous crossroads and can never go back on the road he's chosen. "Not at the moment, in any case. I am hoping my involvement will not be necessary, but if it is, I will face that when it comes." It's hard to bite his tongue and stop himself from pointing out that didn't tell him anything, as if T'Challa could have possibly been any vaguer.
"Don't you think I have a right to know? I'm the one he kidnapped and framed for murder."
"You have every right to know," T'Challa says, "and I hope the right person tells you, and soon, before someone has to force his hand."
"I have to be honest, T'Challa, I'm not following you here at all."
"I know." T'Challa lays a hand on his shoulder, gives it a reassuring squeeze. "I apologize for not being as open about it as I would like to be. This is the way it needs to be for now." Bucky sighs but doesn't press the issue any further. He just doesn't have it in him right now to argue and demand answers, no matter what he feels he's owed. Even if he did, T'Challa doesn't seem like the kind of person who would give in that easily anyway, and Bucky has too much respect for him to waste his breath trying to find out. Now that Zemo is in custody, I've had some time to think about everything that has happened, T'Challa says, his tone almost somber. There are a lot of things I wish I had done differently, but I can't change the past, only the future.
I know what you mean,
Bucky says. I can't go back and save my father, no matter how badly I want to. There is no helping him now. Bucky can feel his grief swelling in the space between their bodies, as evil and consuming as his own. But I can still help you, Bucky, and I would like to, if you would allow me. He swallows the sudden lump in his throat.
With what?
Reclaiming your life. Wakanda is not the third world country the world believes it is. He says it proudly, like he's been waiting to say those words his entire life. I plan to make that fact known to the rest of the world within the coming days. Once I have, my legal team will no longer have to pose as members of neighboring nations. They are some of the best in the world, and I have already given them your case. With your consent, I will spearhead a campaign to exonerate you of Hydra's crimes, and when we win, you will once again be a free man. Bucky petulantly wonders if he's ever truly been a free man, for even a moment in his entire screwed-up life.
And if we lose?
We must take every action possible to ensure we do not. Silence descends on them as they sit together, side by side, on the edge of the dock, just staring out into the blue water. Bucky knows what T'Challa is really offering here. He'd probably let him take Peter to Wakanda to hide away in the jungle for the rest of their lives, keeping the world off their scent, as Bucky asked. But he's offering something better. A genuine chance to get back some of the life Hydra stole from him, and all the joys that would come with it. A higher risk, sure, but a much higher reward as well. It's a heavy choice, but one Bucky knows ultimately he's already made. T'Challa waits for him to speak, pretending to be focused on the view, as if they both don't already know what he's going to say.
I can't be a free man while I still have these trigger words in my head,
he says at last, almost thinking out loud.
As long as I'm still the Winter Soldier, nobody's safe from me, especially not the people I love.
And you will not be granted exoneration as long as those words still hold any power over you, T'Challa adds. I imagine even with our impressive legal defense, any trial you face would demand proof that you are truly free of Hydra's conditioning once and for all. We will have to prove beyond all doubt that you have free will and therefore should be a free man.
Easier said than done.
He brings one leg up onto the dock, bends it in front of him so he can rest his arms and chin on his kneecap.
You know, before all this, the only thing I wanted was to be a good dad.
T'Challa looks sideways at him, like he's trying to figure him out. And now, he grinds his teeth, unable to meet the other man's gaze. Now I know better.
I don't know. It sort of feels like I've lost the right to want anything big or small.
Bucky, T'Challa says. None of this is your fault.
It is, though. Hydra, Zemo. Sure, I had no control over that. But the rest of it. I knew better, but I did it anyway. I let Peter into my life when I knew that someday it would all catch up to me and he'd be in danger. I let him get hurt.
He wants to pull at the strands of his hair. He could feel every single one piercing his scalp.
I might as well have pulled the trigger myself.
T'Challa's hand descends on his shoulder again, and it's more of a comfort than he'd expect, given how every one of his nerve endings are lighting up like a Christmas tree. He doesn't deserve to lean into the touch, but he can't bring himself to shrug it away. You just never learn, do you? You are human, Bucky, just like the rest of us. No one can blame you for wanting Peter, and you should not either. Peter needed you when you found him. Maybe things weren't perfect, but you did the best you could. That is all any of us can do. Bucky doesn't say that his best, his honest best, would have been calling Steve or pounding the pavement in an attempt to find Peter a better home. He doesn't want to argue about the validity of his own guilt, because there's not much anyone can say to abrogate what he knows to be true. He gambled, took a risk, no one should ever take, and in the end it was Peter who was harmed. At least this time, if he takes the risk T'Challa's offering him, the right person's neck will be on the line. Once we remove Hydra's conditioning from your mind and clear your name, you can have that life, T'Challa assures him. You can be the father you want to be. Believe me, my friend, at the very least, you deserve that much. Even if he does, Peter sure as hell deserves a lot better. But maybe this is how he can make amends. How he can prove he really does deserve to call himself Peter's dad, that he'll do anything for his son's happiness. Maybe this is how he escapes the gravitational pull threatening to drag him down and pull him up at the same time, by not deciding to sink or take flight, but to simply move forward. The only thing he knows is that he owes it to Peter to try. I want to help you, T'Challa says, his grip tightening on his shoulder. Please, Bucky, let me help you. And Bucky needs it, knows he has for a long, long time. So he exhales shakily, releasing the tension built up in his chest, and gives one single acceding nod.
Okay,
he says, acutely aware of the gravity of that single tiny word.
What's the plan?
When he steps back inside the house, the silence of it deafens him. T'Challa has gone, but this time not to return to Wakanda. He'll be back in a day or so, maybe sooner. The time has already begun to tick away. He can feel it slipping between his fingers like sand through an hourglass. He goes to find Peter, but there's no sign of the kid anywhere. Friday informs him that Peter and Tony are happily preoccupied in the lab, and he heaves a relieved, defeated sigh and heads for the kitchen. Steve is seated at the island counter, curled around a seeming mug, looking lost in thought. He perks up when he notices Bucky enter the room and smiles, though it does nothing to hide the signs of exhaustion clinging to his features. Hey, how'd it go? Bucky pours himself a cup of tea, letting the bag steep as he considers his answer.
Something tells me you already know,
he says eventually. Steve sighs. It doesn't need to be said out loud, and they both know it. Bucky grabs his cup of tea and takes the seat beside Steve, letting their arms knock together, sitting side by side in silence. He surprises himself when he opens his mouth and says,
I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, Steve.
If Steve is surprised to hear him say that, he doesn't show it. He moves one hand from its sturdy grasp around his mug and intertwines his fingers with Bucky's, comforting. You more, he says, gentle, but with the kind of confidence that makes you want to believe him. It's going to be all right, Buck.
People keep telling me that.
A soft-sad smile crosses Steve's face. He lifts Bucky's hand, gently kisses his metal fingers. I want to go back to New York with you, he says, as if they haven't spent hours talking about doing just that at great length. Together as a family. I want us to build a home together, the three of us. You and me and Peter. Maybe even Tony on the weekends. Bucky chuckles, warmed by the syrupy, sweet smile Steve is kissing into his hand. I want us to finally have the life we dreamed about having when we were Peter's age. But you can't change the past, none of us can. Only the future.
I gotta be honest, Steve. I don't remember what we were dreaming about back then.
I know. He hates how sad Steve sounds, how resigned. Such an out-of-character thing.
There's a lot you don't remember, Bucky. That's why this is the right thing. I promise.
Bucky's chest suddenly feels tight, like some great big frog leapt up and sat on it.
What do you mean?
Steve doesn't look at him. Do you remember your family? When he tries, there are glimpses of color that shine through the white fog, faces that should feel familiar but not quite. He has memories of events sometimes. He knows his father saved up for 4 years and bought him a car when he turned 16. He remembers his mother cooking him his favorite dish, knows she always smiled when he ate the whole thing. He knows their names, but their faces, the sounds of their voices, his actual mental picture of them. Even if Hydra hadn't done their best to erase those things, Bucky doesn't know how much of it he'd be able to remember. It was a lifetime ago.
Sort of,
he says at last, a cop-out, but the only honest answer he could find.
I know I had parents, who they were, stuff like that.
Steve watches him like he's waiting for a very specific reaction, It unnerves Bucky the way the other man's eyes are suddenly mapping out the side of his face, like Bucky's a live grenade, and Steve is trying to figure out when he'll go off.
Can you remember anyone else?
You, Bucky says, but he can tell right away that that wasn't what Steve was looking for. There's something else, something specific. He racks his brain trying to find the missing piece Steve has apparently deemed so important.
Did I have siblings?
He knows that's it the moment it leaves his mouth. Steve is still looking at him like he's the most complicated thing in the world, but there's enough of a shift, a big enough change in the clench of his jaw for Bucky to know he's struck pay dirt.
I think my biography at the Smithsonian mentioned it. I can't really remember, Steve. I'm sorry. I don't think their names were mentioned. Is that what you're trying to tell me? That I have flesh and blood out there somewhere?
Grief washes over Steve's face. His hand tightens around Bucky's.
You had one sibling. Younger. You were the big brother.
He looks away from Bucky and back down at his cup, which stopped steaming long ago.
They're no longer alive. I checked as soon as I got out of the ice, but I brought it up because the last time I mentioned them, you blacked out in my arms.
Realization dawns on him, chilling him to the pit of his stomach.
In the gym, that day I bruised your arm. All I did was mention their name, Steve says. That was all it took. That's how bad Hydra's programming is still affecting you, Bucky. It isn't just the trigger words.
Nausea rages hot and angry in his gut. He knows Steve is right. There's an inkling at the back of his mind, a faint light trying to cut through the darkness. Hydra's taken more from him than even he knows. They took his freedom, his responsibilities as a brother and friend, his very humanity. They would have taken Peter too if he'd let them. And he almost had.
I don't want Hydra to have any power over you anymore, regardless if all their members are dead or captured. I want you to get back the things you've lost, Bucky, and I want you to have new things too, and you can't do that not the way things are now. Not until your name is cleared, and that can't happen until we get that stuff out of your head. T'Challa says he can help, so that's why... I know.
Bucky cuts in because he does. Better than anyone.
I know, Steve, you're right.
He keeps his head down, forces a deep breath down into his lungs, trying to soothe the anxiety roiling inside of him.
T'Challa says he can find a way, and that's the best shot we've got. That's why I need to go with him when he goes back to Wakanda.
He turns to look up at Steve, but Steve's eyes aren't on him. So wide he can see every speck of green in the bright blue of his irises. Bucky swivels in his chair to follow Steve's line of sight, wondering what has him so clammed up, and freezes at the sight of Peter paralyzed at the mouth of the hallway, staring back at him, his big eyes just as wide and filled with fear.